Hello, my name is James, and I'm glad you've chosen to join us at the Orthodox Landmarker, where our focus is ecclesiology, which is the study of the church. In this episode, we are continuing to refute the video titled A Charitable Assessment of Landmarkism, with a deep dive into the meaning of the word church, which is the Greek word Ecclesia. And as you might have already guessed, that's where the word ecclesiology comes from. Today's subject will take up the entire video. We believe that a proper understanding of how the word church was defined in the ancient Greek-speaking world exposes the absurdity of a universal, invisible church up in the ether somewhere. And so, in this clip, this is all that our brother Joshua at the Baptist Broadcast has to say regarding the word ecclesia. Take a look.
Ecclesiology is the Christian doctrine of the church. All right. The word in the Greek for assembly is ecclesia, and so naturally our technical term for the theological locus of the doctrine of the church is ecclesiology.
It seems incomprehensible that one would undertake a teaching on the church without first explaining the meaning of the word ecclesia. But notice, Joshua just simply passes right over this point and goes on to teach a universal, invisible church. If we are going to have a proper understanding of the word church, and thus understand what the essence and the nature of the church is, then we must understand what the writer meant when he chose this word, ecclesia, to describe it. Before we get into our understanding of the word ecclesia, let's define our rules of interpretation. Graves says this: I have interpreted the scriptures relating to my subject, accepting these statements as axiomatic. The Bible was made for man, in the language of men, and must be interpreted by the rules that govern human language. The literal, which is the received meaning of a word, is to be in all cases retained, unless weighty and necessary reasons require that it should be abandoned where a figurative or a secondary may be employed. If the Bible is not to be translated and interpreted by these rules, then it is not a revelation to man, unless the author of it gave the race a lexicon to translate and a commentary to interpret it. Touching its rhetoric, this is an inflexible rule. That is, no passage is figurative unless it contains a figure. A disregard to these fundamental principles by commentators has made wild havoc of many of the most literal portions of the word. End quote. The Christian world has made havoc of this word church. Is Christ trying to obscure its meaning by using it as a figure? Certainly not. It has one simple meaning, as we will see. Ecclesia is the Greek word for church in the New Testament. It is Strong's number 1577, and it's defined there as a calling out, a popular meeting, especially a religious congregation. I want you to notice that all of those words, calling out, a meeting, a congregation, denote the idea of assembly. This is what the word means etymologically. Now, what is etymology? It's the study of the origin and the historical development of words and their meanings. Graves writes this: the Holy Spirit selected the Greek word ecclesia, which had but one possible literal meaning to the Greek, that of a local organization. B.H. Carroll, in his booklet entitled Ecclesia the Church, writes this: Ecclesia's primary meaning is an organized assembly whose members have been properly called out from private homes or business to attend to public affairs. This definition necessarily implies prescribed conditions of membership. First of all, this meaning substantially applies to the ecclesia of a self-governing Greek state. And you'll find this type of usage in Acts chapter 19. Next, the Old Testament ecclesia, or the convocation of Israel. And this is found in Stephen's speech in Acts chapter 7, verse 38. And lastly, it applies to the New Testament ecclesia itself, of which we are examining here in this episode. Now, the Greek city-state, ecclesia, was the assembly of the citizens in city-states of the ancient Greek-speaking world. It was the popular assembly, open to all male citizens as soon as they qualified for citizenship. The assembly was responsible for declaring war, military strategy, and electing the army leaders and other officials. It was responsible for nominating and electing magistrates. You will find ecclesia used in this sense 3 times in the book of Acts, chapter 19, specifically verses 32, 39, and 41. However, it is not translated as church in these passages, but it is translated assembly. Now, Paul was caught in a riot instigated by Demetrius the silversmith, who had made idols and wanted to put an end to Paul's ministry because, he was hurting business. And so in verse 32 of Acts 19, the assembly, the ecclesia, was thrown into confusion. The town clerk who presided over this city council, after he had calmed the mob, says in verse 39, quote, "But if you inquire anything concerning other matters, it shall be determined in a lawful ecclesia, assembly." In verse 41, the ecclesia, the assembly, is dismissed. And so here we have 3 usages of Strong's number 1577. And instead of church, it is translated assembly. Now let's do a deep dive into Acts chapter 19, starting in verse 23 and going all the way through 41. If you want to stop the video and read through those passages just to get familiar with them before we start, please do so. Now in this passage, we will observe that there are 4 Greek words describing different groups of people. Ecclesia is the only word used for a lawful, organized assembly. Now, B.H. Carroll says this in his little booklet, quote, "Indeed, even when by accommodation it is applied to an irregular gathering like Acts 19, 32, and 41, the essential idea of assembly remains." Now, J.R. Graves points out that this idea is not really according to the pattern. Graves says this, quote, "Inasmuch as Acts chapter 19, verses 32, 39, and 41, where ecclesia is rendered assembly, is presumed to prove it means also a mob, I submit the following conclusion. First, ecclesia is nowhere in the whole range of classic Greek usage used to denote a mob or an organized or a riotous crowd. Second, it is nowhere used this way in the Septuagint Greek. Third, it is nowhere else in the 111 instances of its occurrence in the New Testament used to denote a mob or a riotous crowd. This should arouse a suspicion that it may not have this unwarranted meaning here. Certainly, if it can mean a lawful and organized assembly here, we should give it that signification. It certainly can, and I believe it should be given the sense of a lawful assembly, even a political body possessed of civil functions. Ephesus was a free city of Greece, and every free city was governed by an ecclesia, which was an organized body composed of all free citizens entitled to vote, and it was presided over by a recorder. Ephesus then had an ecclesia, and its meeting place the great theater of the city, and its duty to look after the general peace and welfare of the city. Let us now examine Luke's account of what took place, remembering that the ecclesia may have been in session before the uproar commenced, or that it, as it was its duty to do, came immediately together as soon as cognizant of this tumult. Demetrius and his workmen and the mob, having seized Gaius and Aristarchus, rushed with them into the assembly. Now in verse 32 it says this, "And some of the mob cried one thing, and some another. And the ecclesia," that is, the city council, "was confused by these varied cries, while no one definite charge was brought to its notice of which it could take cognizance." Now mark, it was not the ecclesia that was riotous, but, verse number 29, it was the oklos, the crowd that had rushed into the theater, where the Ecclesia, the assembly of Ephesus, was in orderly session, or had gathered to hold one. For it was the oklos, and not the Ecclesia, that the presiding officer of the Ecclesia quieted. He informed this riotous oklos crowd in verse 38. If Demetrius and the workmen with him had a charge against any man, there were courts and the proconsuls. But if it was about other things, the Ecclesia would settle it. The Ecclesia was responsible for public tumults, insurrections, etc. And the officer appealed to the crowd to be quiet and to disperse. For, said he, speaking for the Ecclesia in verse 40, we, the Ecclesia, are even in danger of being accused about the tumult of today, there being no cause by which we, the Ecclesia, can excuse this concourse. And that word concourse there means a riotous mob. And the Greek word is sustrophes, not ecclesia. And having said this, he adjourned, that is, he dissolved the assembly, the ecclesia, not the sustrophes, the mob, which he could not dismiss. Now, in this account, we have in the Greek 4 terms used. The first one is demos, or people. And this is found in verses 30 and 33, and it's Strong's number 1218. The second term is oklos, or throng, also means crowd. And this is found in verse 26 and verse 35, and that's Strong's number 3793. The third term is sustrophes, translated concourse, meaning a riotous mob. And this is found in verse number 40, and it is Strong's number 4963. And of course, the last term is ecclesia, meaning assembly, and this word is found in verses 32, 39, and 41, denoting a body having civil jurisdiction, a lawful assembly. And so ecclesia and sustrophes, a riotous mob, are never used interchangeably, never mean the same body. Were we to admit that ecclesia here meant a mob, since the church in no way involves a mob, this passage has no bearing on what is the church. Liddell and Scott, in their Greek lexicon, define the word ecclesia as an assembly of citizens, summoned by the crier, the legislative assembly. Now, what is the relevance of all this? Well, this establishes further the Greek usage of ecclesia as that of a specific, a local, a visible, and lastly, an organized body, an organized assembly. Next, what of the Old Testament ecclesia? This was the convocation of Israel as seen in Acts chapter 7:38. This was Stephen's speech. Now, what is a convocation? It is a large formal assembly of people. And this is what happened when Moses gathered the people together at Mount Sinai. And so, again, this is what the writers of the New Testament understood the word to mean. And we are to use it in this sense. And so, therefore, ecclesia applies in the same way to the New Testament, the church that Jesus built. Finally, I'd like to close this section with a quote from Anglican Bishop Dean Trench. He says this, quote, "Ecclesia, as all do know, was the lawful assembly in a free Greek city of all those possessed of the rights of citizenship for the transaction of public affairs. That they were summoned is expressed in the latter part of the word. That they were summoned out of the whole population is expressed in the first. And so both the calling and the calling out are moments to be remembered when the word is assumed into a higher Christian sense." End quote. Now I ask you, how does an invisible church assemble? How does that organization conduct business? Additionally, take a Catholic church, a universal visible church comprised of parishes throughout the entire earth. How does this organization assemble into one place? The only model that conforms to the New Testament is the local, visible, tangible New Testament church. I have a city council in my town. This city council is called out and they meet in the town hall and they conduct business on behalf of the citizens. Local, visible, tangible. To use this word in the sense of being an invisible institution is in fact to twist the scriptures and make the scriptures say the exact reverse of what is intended. The church not only assembles, but it doesn't assemble. The church is not only visible, but it is invisible. The church is not only local, but it is universal. Can any language be more absurd? The next point in our analysis of Ecclesia, I find varying writers to come up with different numbers on the following statistics. So, generally speaking, I come up with the following numbers. Ecclesia, or the word church, is used in the New Testament 118 times, referring to the Christian institution. And in 100 to 108 of these usages, it undoubtedly refers to the locality of the organization. It's a local, visible institution. In these other remaining, say, 10 to 18 instances, it is used figuratively or by synecdoche, where a part is put for the whole, the singular for the plural, one for all. In each of these instances, what is true of all the churches is true of any one of the churches. Examples are, say, every scripture usage of the word church in the letter to the Ephesians is by synecdoche or figurative. In the book of Colossians 1:18, Matthew 16:18. This will account for explaining Joshua's objections to local church usage in these places when he says this.
The other thing, and I think this is very, very important, if you say that the Baptist Church is the only church and that there is no such thing as a universal church, but only local congregations, right? What does Matthew 16:18 mean? Because local churches go in and out of existence all the time.
There is no occasion whatever for any misapprehension touching this use, nor is there one passage that affords the shadow of a ground for the idea of an invisible church in heaven, any more than for a huge universal, national, or provincial church on earth. But the multitude of passages preclude the idea. Regarding the figurative use, you might also think of it as an institutional use of this word church. B.H. Carroll writes this, for example, if an English statesman, referring to the right of each individual citizen to be tried by his peers, should say, quote, "On this rock, England will build her jury, and all the powers of tyrants shall not prevail against it." He uses the term jury in the abstract sense, in the sense of an institution. But when this institution finds concrete expression or it becomes operative, it is always a particular jury of 12 men and never an aggregation of all juries into one big jury. I might add, nor is it one massive invisible jury. The invisible idea is absurd in this sense.
Is he talking about his one church? I mean, it is in the singular, so you would think that you would just say, taking the scriptures at face value, that's Christ's one church, and then that in some sense that's anytime a word is used in the fashion of like an integer, a one, it's a general term, right? It's not particularized.
Now, Joshua seems to think that because the word church is used in the singular, it therefore cannot be a reference to individual local churches, which comprise the institution that Christ founded upon the earth, and must then be a reference to an invisible non-entity. He doesn't realize that he isn't following the laws of language when he makes this conclusion. Let me illustrate. If a law writer should say in trials of fact, by oral testimony, the court shall be the judge of the law, and the jury shall be the judge of the facts. And if he should add, in giving evidence, the witness shall tell what he knows to the jury and not to the court. He evidently uses the term court, jury, witness in a generic sense. But in the application, the generic always becomes particular That is, a particular judge, a particular jury, or a particular witness, and never an aggregate of all judges into one big judge, or of all juries into one big jury, nor of all witnesses into one big witness. And I want you to underline this statement. Hence we say that the laws of language require that all abstract and generic uses of the word ecclesia should be classified with a particular assembly in mind.
If the local church is the only church that exists, and local churches are prevailed upon by sin all the time, well then, what church is Jesus talking about?
Now, Matthew 16:18 is a prime example. When Jesus says, "On this rock I will build my ecclesia," while the "my" distinguished his ecclesia from the Greek state ecclesia and the Old Testament Convocation of Israel ecclesia, the word itself retains its ordinary meaning. Matthew 18:17 is an example of this generic use. That is, it designates the kind of tribunal to which difficulties must be referred without the restriction of application to any one particular church by name. What I mean is that while its application must always be to a particular church, yet it is not restricted to just one church, as the church at Jerusalem, but it's equally applicable to every other particular church. Okay, let's look quickly at Ephesians chapter 5. Look at verse 23. When Paul says the husband is the head of the wife, we have the same generic use. The terms husband and wife are not to be restricted in application to, say, John Jones and his wife, but apply equally to every other specific husband and wife. If Christ is speaking of a universal church in Ephesians, then he would also be speaking of a universal husband and a universal wife. But no one would dare take that position.
Jesus says, I'll build my church. It's a particular church. It's a particular assembly. It's one assembly that he will build. He has to be talking not about local churches, because local churches go in and out of existence all the time.
Hopefully now you can see that all the generic uses of the word church refer to a particular church in an institutional sense. Please note, in Matthew 16:18, Christ has but one church. But in the book of Revelation, Christ speaks to his 7 churches. How does Joshua account for this discrepancy if Christ has but only one church? In Revelation, the book of the end things, we are told this, quote, "The 7 candlesticks which thou sawest are the 7 churches." It is revealed here that Christ walks in the midst of these candlesticks, commending, rebuking, and removing candlesticks as he sees fit. So if a church goes out of existence, that is, apostatizes, it is because Christ has changed its status. We are also told in Matthew chapter 18, verse 20 by Christ himself, he says, "For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name," that is, in my authority, "there am I in the midst of them." In both of these passages, we see the headship of Christ in the midst of his churches, forming and removing candlesticks. He gives any company of scripturally baptized believers direct authority to exist, and removes its candlestick if that church should fall away. He speaks to individuals within each church by saying, quote, "Him that overcometh," fill in the blank. It must be remembered, each church is made up of people. Each person must follow and obey Christ. To each church, he concludes with the statement, quote, "He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches." I do not know at what point Christ removes a candlestick, and hence its status. But I do know that he does. Obviously, churches go in and out of existence. But that is in no way proof that other churches do not remain in place. The gates of hell cannot prevail against Christ's church, the institution, because of the simplicity of it. The devil may scatter a church today, but by morning 5 can be formed. We have the very declaration of Christ himself, it being the only specific instructions from Holy Writ that tells us how and when a church comes into existence. And that is Matthew 18, verse 20. This we do know. At what point a church loses its vital life remains a judgment of Christ alone. Lastly, if Christ has but one church, universal and invisible, why does he speak of churches in the last recorded reference of the word ecclesia in Revelation chapter 22 and verse 16? Jesus says, I, Jesus, have sent mine angel to testify unto you these things in the churches. I am the root and the offspring of David and the bright and morning star. If there was anywhere in the entire Bible that this invisible institution should appear, you would think it would be 6 verses from the end of the most symbolic book of the New Testament. But no, he still refers to churches in the plural. Reformed theology, of which Joshua is advocating, is a departure from orthodoxy. This is what the landmarkers sought to stave off in their ecclesiology. The Roman Church and the ancient writers believed in the visibility and the locality of Christ's church here upon this earth. This was pure orthodoxy. It makes no difference what certain groups argued about 1,500 years after the advent of Christ. We only need to examine the ante-Nicene era, when Christianity was in its infancy, to see through the error of the invisible church theory. The Reformers invented the invisible church doctrine in order to justify their rebellion to Rome, their mother church, and the church in which their baptisms originated. The only place Christ's church exists, and ever will exist, is here on earth. This is an essential truth of the divine word. J.R. Graves explains this position in his book, Old Landmarkism. What is it? Quote, since I have used the terms church and kingdom, it may be well to explain here what I understand by them and their relation to each other. They were used as synonymous terms by the evangelists, so long as Christ had but one organized church, for they were then one in the same body. So soon as churches were multiplied, see Acts 9:31, a distinction arose. The kingdom embraced the first church, and now it embraces all the churches. As a side note, this is how Graves understood Matthew 16:18. When Christ spoke these words, there was only one church in existence at that time. Context is key. Graves continues, quote, the churches of Christ constitute the kingdom of Christ, just as the 12 tribes, each separate and independent of itself, constituted the kingdom of Israel, as the provinces of a kingdom constitute a kingdom, as all the separate sovereign states of the United States constitute the Republic of America. Now, as no foreigner can become a citizen of this republic without being naturalized as a citizen of some one of the states, so no one can enter the kingdom of Christ without becoming a member of some one of his visible churches. End quote. Baptism is an ordinance of Christ's kingdom, for Christ himself says, except a man be born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter into the kingdom of God. It was of a visible earthly organization of which he spoke. For he says, quote, if I have told you of earthly things, and you believe not, how shall you believe if I tell you of heavenly things? John 3:12. Graves continues, quote, the locality of Christ's church, and therefore kingdom, is this earth. All the subjects of his kingdom are here. All the work of his church is here. This earth was given to him by his Father to be the sole seat of his throne and his kingdom. At this point, Graves references Psalm 2, most notably verses 6 through 9. It says there, yet have I set my king upon my holy hill of Zion. I will declare the decree. The Lord hath said unto me, thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee. Ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron, thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Graves continues, all authority, power, and judgment over all flesh were vested in Christ. and he was appointed to reign on this earth until he should put all his enemies under his feet. And then will come the end, when he will give up the kingdom to his Father, when the Godhead will rule with undivided scepter over the earth, as before sin had entered into it. Christ then has no church in heaven, never had, nor has he as Messiah any kingdom in heaven, or will he ever have. Nor, if we will believe the Scriptures rather than mere theorists, will he always have a kingdom on this earth. Remember, it is said in the Scriptures, "Then cometh the end, when he shall have delivered up the kingdom to God, even the Father." That's 1 Corinthians 15:24. Did he not teach his disciples to pray, "Our Father, who art in heaven, thy kingdom come"? Not Christ's kingdom, for that had already come, and the disciples were in it, but the Father's kingdom. And when the Father's will shall be done in this earth, as it now is done in heaven, will not this earth then be a heaven as much as any other place in the universe? Let me repeat that. But the Father's kingdom, and when the Father's will shall be done on this earth, as it now is done in heaven, will not this earth then be a heaven as much as any other place in the universe? In fact, this is the direction of travel. Our final destination is not heaven, but rather God is coming to dwell with us here on the earth. Revelation chapter 21, verses 1 through 3, and verse 10. Look at those verses. They use language like coming down, descending. It says there, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them. Next, ecclesia is used in the plural throughout the New Testament. It is used in the plural 36 times, which fact is demonstrative that the universal or provincial idea of the church was not then known. This also rules out the idea of a universal invisible church. Next, the ecclesia of the New Testament could and was required to assemble in one place. This is impossible for a universal or an invisible church to do. It was often required to assemble. For proofs of this, go to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 18. It says there, Paul says, "First of all, when ye come together in the church, I hear that there be divisions among you, and I partly believe it." Another verse is 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 23, where it says there, "If therefore the whole church be come together into one place, and all speak with tongues," and so on. Another usage is Matthew chapter 18 and verse 17, and it says there, "And if he shall neglect to hear them, tell it unto the church. But if he neglect to hear the church, let him be unto thee as an heathen man and a publican." And so we see that in all these cases, the church has to be assembled together in order to take care of these issues. And so discipline in the Lord's Supper can only be administered by the assembled church. And so explain to me how an indivisible church carries out these functions. Next, we have ecclesia that is used in a single city or a single house. Proofs of this could be found in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 2. It says there, "Unto the church of God which is at Corinth," has locality. Also Acts chapter 11 verse 22. It says there, "The church which was at Jerusalem," again, locality. Also 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 19. It says there, "The churches of Asia salute you. Aquila and Priscilla salute you much in the Lord, with the church that is in their house," locality. "Salute Nymphas and the church which is in his house," Colossians 4:15. And finally we have Philemon 2, "And to the church in thy house." There are others, but this is just a few examples of the use of the word church, and it's always used in a local sense, and it has visibility, has tangibility. Now, a complete church was composed of the members of these individual households, and probably a few others, and would customarily meet in the houses of these brethren for worship and the transaction of business. and it is certain that it could have been nothing else than a local society. Let's review what we've learned today. First, Strong's defines ecclesia as a calling out, a popular meeting, a religious congregation. 90% of the usages in the New Testament refer to local, visible congregations. About 10% of the usages are by synecdoche, meaning apart put for the whole, singular for plural, one for all. Ecclesia is used in the plural 36 times. Inherent in the word are the ideas of being called out and assembling. Discipline and communion can only be administered by an assembled church. And lastly, a majority of ecclesia uses are to specific congregations in cities or houses. And then, of course, we throw in the idea that the ancient world knew nothing of the idea of an invisible and universal, spiritual, mystical church in the heavenlies, up in the ether somewhere. In fact, classical Greek usage precludes the idea of ecclesia being in one case a local visible assembly, and at the same time an absurd notion of an invisible universal presence, mystically comprised of all the living saints which are here now on earth. Ask yourself the question, how can this invisible institution assemble? The use of ecclesia in the invisible sense is an oxymoron of the word. Thank you, and I hope you've enjoyed this study. If you like this content, please be sure to like this video down below and subscribe to our channel. In our next video, we will continue to build our case that landmarkism is not only historical, but biblical. And here's a final parting quote from Gerald's book, Baptist Church Perpetuity. He says this, quote, "In the invisible church and kingdom theory are all disorganizers who reject baptism and church organization. Under the pretense of great zeal and spirituality, they make the invisible everything and the organization nothing." End quote. Take care and God bless.